Hello, and welcome to another episode of Dear Jane. I'm Marcy Little, your host. My co-host is Scott Baker. Scott, how are you today?
Doing very well. How are you?
I'm great.
I'm
Would
a,
you
li-
tell us, please?
I'm a
Oh,
little nervous about today, I got to tell you,
why is that?
because we're going to be talking about women,
Mm-hmm.
and it's going to be women talking about women, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's me.
Yeah, you not identifying as a woman today?
No. So I'm going to
No,
feel out of place, but hopefully it won't be like a sore thumb.
no, I don't think you will. You just feel free to jump in. We've bought into this narrative that men aren't allowed to have an opinion unless they have the right opinion,
Right.
but we can define what the right opinion is.
Yeah. Well, that's true. It's our podcast, so we can do
So,
what we want.
yeah, we can do what we want. So you just chime right on in.
All right.
It's going to be a great conversation. Today's guest will be wonderful. Before I tell everyone about today's guest, Scott, would you tell everyone about Cogency Strategic?
Yeah, we are proud to be sponsored by Cogency Strategic. Lots of political battles going on this year and really in years to come, but especially this year, things are starting to get hot and heavy in about 10 states or so where they're going to try to codify unlimited, unrestricted abortion into state constitutions. It's just the reality post Roe. And so we've got to win these battles. So far, the pro life movement is off to a slow start, to say the least, but we can win. But we have to use modern techniques, modern messaging, modern delivery methods, and Cogency Strategic can do that. So if you're a group that has an interest in any of these races or you're involved, why don't you check them out? CogencyStrategic.com. You can find out what they can do and how they can help you win your pro-life battle.
Awesome. It's time for the pro-life movement to have some more wins. So definitely check them out, cogencystrategic.com. They'll be able to help you out. Today's guest with us on the Dear Jane podcast is Dr. Carrie Gress. She is a fellow at the Washington, D.C. based think tank Ethics and Public Policy Center and a scholar at the Institute for Human Ecology at Catholic University of America. She has her doctorate in philosophy from the Catholic University of America and is the editor at the online women's magazine Theology of Home. She's lived and worked both professionally in Washington, D.C. and Rome, Italy, and her work has been translated into 9 languages. Her most recent book is The End of Woman, How Smashing the Patriarchy Destroyed Us. We talk about that. We talk about if it's possible to be a pro-life feminist. We talk about what the pro-life movement has gotten wrong when it comes to messaging and how we can correct course. I think people really enjoy listening to this conversation we had today with Carrie, and I hope you will check out her works online. Without further ado, here's Dr. Carrie Gress. Carrie, thanks so much for joining us on the Dear Jane podcast today. We're excited to dive into a number of different topics with you. You have written a lot about womanhood, motherhood, the pro-life movement, abortion. What is it that you think we get wrong on the pro-life side when it comes to messaging?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. It's obviously great to be here to talk to you about this today. I think one of the things that we get wrong is that we spend a lot of time trying to make our arguments in a very rational and reasonable way, which obviously I think is important. I have a PhD in philosophy, but I've learned the hard way that we're living really in a culture that is very post-rational. And so I think that one of the things that we don't do well is we don't storytell. And we tell stories about women who have had really, incredible odds and just the world stacked against them and being able to come out on top and, have incredible lives with their babies that are saved. And I think that that's important. But what we're not doing is appealing to women on kind of a broader scale when it comes to how it is that we storytell, that where it makes it somewhat aspirational. And if you look at what the left has done in the last 50 years, I mean, they've really cornered this market on the culture, and partially because that's all they have. They don't have the truth about children and motherhood and what it means to be a woman, and so they have to really portray it as the pro-abortion side as looking very attractive and compelling. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have been almost just kind of stopped in our tracks in terms of what has happened post Roe, and haven't been able to really get moving again, is that we haven't recognized how much they've really entrenched themselves in the culture through that kind of storytelling, through all the media. It's not just Hollywood, it's politics, it's fashion, it's book publishing, all of those ways that sort of have locked us out. And we've done very little with regard to that because we've been so focused on the political for very good reason. But I think it's really time to start shifting gears and help women just figure out what it means to be a woman again, to help women understand just the beauty and the compelling aspects of motherhood that I feel like they've been so lost in the culture today.
Just so I have the right context, when you talk about reaching women and helping with this messaging, that sort of thing, are we talking about women who are considering abortion, or are we talking about women at large and just sort of winning the debate, the ongoing cultural discussion?
I think it's both, actually. I think that, one of the things that's really interesting is just to even see how the celebrity culture trickles down to every woman after that. If you've got celebrities who are saying something, then suddenly it takes on a new fashionable element for women who are, either middle class or lower class. And so I think that one of the things that could be incredibly advantageous for women who are contemplating abortion is just to help them see that this is not the end of their life. This isn't somehow going to just destroy their world. And this is, one of the things that the left has done incredibly well, is to say abortion is there so that you can have a life, so that you can have freedom and independence and do what you want to do. And that's really what we're kind of fighting against, is that aspect, because what they're not saying is, you're also going to probably be more depressed. You're going to be your life is not going to be rich and full when you make these kinds of decisions. They don't show the other half of the coin of what it is that they're promising. So anyway, I think they're of a piece. I think, women have been sold some general ideas for the last 50 years, and we've bought into them so deeply without any pushing against them culturally, that it would trickle down dramatically into women who are contemplating abortion.
I've noticed the other side uses such compelling imagery, and their message is always very simple and easy to latch onto. And you spoke to this a little bit earlier, that, we like to get into these rational debates and rationalize things and talk to people logically. And I think in general, that's something that conservatives have done and the right has done. But we're not connecting to people. So can you paint a picture of what does that look like? Obviously, on the one side, we have like The Handmaid's Tale. Everyone knows that. That's what the other side portrays us to be. Mm-hmm. What are some ways that we can counter that image and that visual? Or even, I'm thinking about, they've painted us in this way. Is there room, is there space for us to show the real picture of where their ideology leads and where their broken promises lead?
Yeah, no, I think that's, the big question is, how do we, first of all, we have to recognize what they've done with The Handmaid's Tale. They have articulated their position as freedom and life and, choice and all of that. And then they've articulated our position as red robes, fertility cult. I mean, it's genius if you think about it, how they're the ones that have set the terms. And, like you mentioned, with that one image of the women in the red robes and the red bonnets, they just say so much. But, also things like a lot of sound bites and even alliteration, Planned Parenthood. There's a lot of sound bites that have sort of the same letter that start with their messaging. And we just haven't thought in these terms, again, because we're trying to be rational. I think there absolutely is room for painting the fruit of what it is that they're promising in a remarkable way. One of the things I know, I've been thinking a lot about smoking, because I grew up with smokers. My father smoked, my grandmother smoked, And, it was always something I sort of thought about. And there were all these there was major legislation going on, trying to sue the tobacco companies and whatnot. And I think that some of the most powerful images, I can still remember one old woman smoking, yellow fingers, and she's smoking through a trach. It's showing just like this is a serious, awful addiction, and look what it does to you. You get to this point where you have to smoke a cigarette through your trach, and that stuck with me. I was probably like 10 years old when that came out, and that visual is really embedded. So I think there is a way to portray that, but I think that we also have to do the positive so much better. We don't have a single, as far as I know, like conservative or pro-life home show. We don't have a magazine. We don't have any kind of like mainstream talk shows and things that really focus on this. And gratefully, it's changing a little bit. Obviously, and people are getting into movies, things like the Chosen. Certainly, Unplanned was amazing breakthrough in that. So the messaging is people are beginning to think in this direction, but I think we just need to do a lot more of it, and in terms of trying to help women have a visual framework to think about themselves as women and as mothers instead of just The Handmaid's Tale. We need to give them the intellectual hooks to start thinking about how that looks instead of just being afraid of what they think it looks like.
I appreciate you bringing up that example of the woman smoking through her trach, and that I remember the same kind of image.
You remember
Right,
it?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, you do. Well, which leads me to, and this is really timely for us because we have had, just recently, we've had some guests, Scott Klusendorf and some others, who talk about, they argue the best way to make our case on the horrors of abortion is to just show it. Just show, the graphic images and that sort of thing. And we've all, if you've been to some pro-life events, you've seen some of these graphic images. And I'll be honest with you, Carrie, at first I was like, no, we don't want any part of that. That's just too jarring, too negative. But they make an argument that has really started to move me. And that is, as you look at a lot of the social justice movements over the years, whether it's slavery or the Holocaust or whatever, it was the imagery of the reality that really moved people. So I say all that to get back to your point, which I think is right. How do we strike that balance? Or what, in your opinion, what use or role might there be for some of that more graphic communication?
Well, I think the one of the points that we're not seeing. I'm not a big fan of the graphic communication. I think it's it turns my stomach. I've had 5 children, 7 miscarriages. It's just not something that resonates with me in a way that I feel like is going to win people hearts over. So I can see the benefits of it in certain ways, just the reality of it. But the victim that is also part of this is also what happens to the woman in this. And that's one of the things that we are not showing is what happens to the woman's life. And we know this in terms of, the toughening of a woman's heart is going to happen through this experience, the brokenness, we know all the statistics about depression and suicide and, all the negative things that are associated with it on a mental level, not to mention just even the biological level, connection with breast cancer and whatnot. So I think it's those kinds of things because the key is that the left has really been focused on women. That's what they're focused on. They're not focusing on the baby. And the baby element is not compelling to them. But if you tell a woman that there's going to be ramifications for her, then that I think suddenly becomes more compelling because they're focused on their own self-interest. And so I think that's probably the better way to go is to look at, I meet women all the time because I'm talking a lot about what feminism has done to women. And so you hear, I didn't follow feminism because I thought I was going to end up, 50, 60 years old by myself alone. My parents didn't have any other children. I have no siblings. This kind of isolation that many women have ended up with because of it. So I think we can shift it. If we can shift it to a way of showing the fruits of what happens when we follow this, this ideal of independence, then that is probably going to be a lot more compelling because it's going to resonate with the women who are making the decision instead of the horror of, what it is that they're doing with the abortion elements.
I think you're right that there are definitely two victims. There's women fall victim to the ideology. And like you say, they end up living their lives one way, expecting a certain outcome because that's what they were promised. And
Mm-hmm.
that's just really not the reality. I remember reading Sue Ellen Bowder's book
Yeah.
several years ago, Subverted.
Mm-hmm.
She was a writer, during the sexual revolution for Cosmopolitan. And she just talks about how all the stories of the Cosmo girl, they just made up. They were never based on true stories. They were never based on fact. It was them idealizing what they wanted the promises of the sexual revolution to be, which is, you can separate sex from marriage, you can separate pregnancy from all of these things, and craft this life that you want, and it all is just a lie. And so I think you're right that we have to be able to speak to those victims too, those women who are victims of that ideology. But part of what I think you're getting at and what we have to do is cast a better vision for them. So
Mm-hmm.
if this Cosmo girl philosophy and ideology is what you were chasing, it's not real. So you're not chasing or fashioning your life after something that's real. So we have to paint a different picture. And I think sometimes we hear that on the pro-life side and we're like, okay, great, I'm going to get a story published somewhere, and that's good. But I think what you're talking about is more broadly like I hate to use the word, like the phrase cultural revolution, but kind of like we need to be able to infiltrate Hollywood and create better films and better stories and better books, to be able to show women a better way, and a way that has had such horrible branding.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think we have to do it in a way that's really compelling and beautiful and smart and savvy. And I think we have all of that, but it's just a matter of trying to focus on that. I have actually created a series of books called Theology of Home, which really looks at at the home itself and why it's such a taboo to talk about homemaking. And, this has been such a fun book to work on because my co-author Noelle Mary and I really focused on those elements of the home that are incredibly popular today. That things, gardening is popular, baking bread is popular. All the elements of home are popular, but homemaking is still coming along. But it's making it an inroads for sure. Maybe in the last 4 years, but it still feels very taboo to say it. And so I think that it's been really exciting to imagine, how do we articulate the home in a way that's actually compelling? Because, Betty Friedan and all the women in the second wave believed that the home was a comfortable concentration camp. I mean, this is a language that Betty Friedan used in her book, The Feminine Mystique. And so how do we help women really see that this is actually an incredible space, and it's an incredible place for our family. It's not just meant to be a hotel, but there's actually, all the great gifts that women have. There's, nourishing and hospitality. We're providing safety. We're providing comfort. All those things that then prepare for the people that live in the home to face the world. And so what we did with this book was not just create some really rich, beautiful content that people love, but we also had it illustrated. We had a lot of pictures that were taken of families inside the home. And, this book has become just a great bestseller. It's all over the wedding registries and bridal showers and that kind of thing. So it's been really a joy to be a part of. So we're hoping at some point we'll get it into a TV series because it just so naturally lends itself to that kind of, 6 episodes on, each episode could be on a different aspect of the home. But what's been interesting for us is just to see how radical of an idea this book is in terms of selling it. And, we're shopping it just a couple of different places right now. And so hopefully it will come to light, but there's really nothing like it, why isn't there anything like it? So I think it just takes a fair amount of imagination and just really envisaging ourselves what it is that is the richness in our lives, and then how do we communicate that in a compelling and compelling way that is going to stay with people as something that they want. And we've had, of course, criticism like it was too beautiful, which seems really silly because nobody on the left would ever say that about a magazine. Like, I'm just not going to look at that book because it was too beautiful. It just sort of bespeaks of really not getting the point of it, what it is that we're doing. So anyway, I think there's a lot of room for creativity in this area, and even recognizing, this was something that was also hard for me to sort through was, with this PhD in philosophy, it felt like this was fluff. This was not important. This was something that wasn't really going to do anything for anybody. And yet, Noelle and I get emails every day from people saying, thank you so much. You have changed my life. We got a really beautiful story of a woman who lost one of her children, and she was an interior designer, and this is a way that she helped to process her grief. I mean, really amazing things. So I think if we add the richness and the beauty, those are the things that really speak to a woman's heart. And that's what we've been missing so much in the last 50
I
years.
don't know, Carrie. You got to be careful. If you keep talking about how fulfilling it is to be a mother and that sort of thing, you're going to find yourself with Harrison Butker and all the grief that he has received.
Oh, believe me, I get plenty of grief. I get plenty of grief.
So I was reading, you had a piece earlier this spring in the Federalist entitled "The Pro-Life Movement Has a Storytelling Problem," and you make the case that, and you mentioned this already, how we need to have more images and sort of more aspirational, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. As I was reading it, it's like, yeah, that's really actually good marketing across the board. I mean, it does. I mean, gee, there's a clone. I want to be like that dude, or wow, look at that car. I want to be like that person. So that makes a lot of sense. How do we balance aspirational though with relatable in this case?
Well, I think that's, one of the things that's sort of the magic of aspirational. It is relatable. People want that. There's something, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Luke Burgess, who wrote that book called Wanted, and it's all about this idea of desire and copying and mimesis and, not to get too deep into the weeds of that, but women in particular are very, very susceptible to what it is that other women are doing. And, I use the example of Abby Johnson. I mean, you guys know her story well. But when she was working for Planned Parenthood, did her parents like her job? No, they hated her job. Did her husband like her job? No, he hated her job. But who liked her job? All of her women friends liked her job, and all the women that she worked with. And so she got, kudos and honors and bonuses and all of the, all the things from the people that she was working with, from the other women, that was really emotionally feeding her. Despite the fact that her family, who was closest to her, didn't like it. That was, the influence of the women was much greater than the influence of her family, which seems counterintuitive. But if you recognize how much, the way in which women feel accepted and, affirmed, it's coming through that lens. And so I think that's why it's, the more aspirational, the more beautiful, the more compelling we can make these, the more savvy and just beautiful women with children, like it's instead of frumpy women, all of that, some great B-roll, all of these things I think are really, really important for capturing women, because women also can sense when something isn't quite up to par, because we are targeted with images and the fashion elements all day long, whether it's on our phones, on Instagram or whatnot. So that's kind of the nice thing, is it's not like we have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to sort of start paying attention to what it is that women are drawn to, and then start working through that instead of sort of creating something totally brand new. But obviously laced with a pro-life message instead of with the leftist message. Showing, and in our books, we actually talk about kind of this idea of the forbidden pictures, showing competent men who are good fathers, and, women who, whose children have a lot of children, but they all look clean and healthy, and, they're not a mess, or, she's not pulling her hair out. I think these are the things that we have really taken over as far as women's impression of what motherhood looks like. And it certainly doesn't always look like that. There are moments, but I think the more aspirational, the better, because it's in the aspirational that's what women relate to, because it's there's trends are so important.
I think it was in that same article, you talk about the difference between what speaks to men and what speaks to women. And even as I listened to you talk, and I don't know how that explanation resonated with you, Scott, as a man, but I think about even the accounts that I follow on Instagram, the ones that I like the most are the ones that are aspirational and that point me to something else. And when I think about that contrasted even with what the other side portrays, it's like I don't really want that life, like where my life is just consumed by a pet as like a fur baby, or it just doesn't. I think there's so much more that's aspirational and higher aspirational that we have to show on our side. But could you speak to a little bit the differences between how we've portrayed some of our pro-life messages for donors who are largely the higher capacity donors tend to be men, what resonates with them versus what resonates with
Yeah.
women when we talk about shifting culture?
Yeah, I think what you just said was really important, that idea of going higher and of elevating things. And, I mean, it's that kind of stuff that really just starts getting your emotions and your intellect and that creative juices flowing. When it's all those pieces together, that's what I think really speaks to us. So I think that's a great point. But Noelle and I have found this, it's been really interesting to see. And both Noelle and I are married, and we recognize that what we're fascinated and drawn into, our husbands are not at all. I can't tell you how many times my husband will bring an idea to me. He's like, I'm just telling you this and just to get it off my chest because I've been stewing about it. And he'll tell me the idea, and I'll be like, no, I'm sorry, that's just not quite right. Thank you so much for throwing that out there, but it's just not going to work. So I think there is a sense of women have kind of this sixth sense about trending and influencers and the messaging and all of that men just don't get. And so and there's nothing wrong with that, except for the fact that if you have all of your funding coming from men who don't get it, then the funding is not going to go in the right place. And so it's interesting to just even see like who is making larger donations. It's usually men. Women are obviously very influential, but they don't usually give the much larger amounts. And so things are not earmarked for, we would like to see this go into a pro-life magazine that's really savvy, that every woman wants to put her hands on and be thumbing through and sharing with her friends. So far I haven't heard of a donor asking for that. But can you imagine how well that would do? I mean, it's not that hard to imagine that you could have, one magazine for pro-life women, how popular it would be if done well and, had great content and great ideas and things that were, that span women's interests. So anyway, I think that's something that we really have to start facing too, is just what's going to resonate with men is going to be a lot different than what women see in a lot of respects.
Speaking of men, I am a man. I identify as a man. One of the challenges, though, I think we have as a movement is what's happening to me right now. Have this little tape playing of, you know what, this is a conversation about women, between women, and I have no role whatsoever. I have no business being in this conversation because men are told that all the time, right? When it comes to this topic, men, you don't have a uterus, butt out. How do we break through that and get over that?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. And this has been one of the things that I have loved about my book called The End of Woman that came out last August, is just how many men have felt like they have a voice because of this book. Because in that book, I break down really what has happened ideologically to women, really for almost 200 years, but more specifically in the last 50 years because of the second wave of feminism, which has told men, you aren't allowed to talk about women. Women in the feminist movement are really the ideal and more important, more powerful, more in control. And so they've been able to shut men down. And, I was actually just talking with Jordan Peterson about this. I had lunch with him yesterday, and he was saying that he thought, it's just amazing how men don't know how to tackle that. They don't know how to respond to that. They don't know whether they should jump into it and risk being scolded. And so I think in a lot of respects that there's a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of women to invite men back into this conversation instead of the constant scolding, because nobody knows what to do with that narcissistic woman who's, feels like she's empowered and she's the one that's telling you to be quiet. But we know, obviously, as a culture, it's vitally important that men are involved in these discussions. It's incredible the amount of damage that's being done to men by abortion, by feminism, by all of these elements that are shutting men down, and the gifts that men have to offer to women particularly through the family, as fathers. So I think it's a question of just trying to create an environment where there are enough of us who are saying, we want your voices, we want to hear what you have to say, we want your opinions, and we need you to actually help us a lot more by speaking up, and just knowing that we're all going to take it in terms of women who feel like it's really a matter of power and control, and are trying to make us be quiet. So yeah, I think it's a challenge, but I have deep sympathy for men, because I don't think that it feels like there's any way to win an argument, certainly about feminism and about abortion, with women who are so ideological. But for those of us who are not deeply entrenched in that ideology, I think it's also, for women, we need to start really be open to the gifts that men have and bring to the table, and encourage them to speak and to be courageous about
Hey,
it.
Marcy, before you ask your question, hey, Carrie, tell Jordan Peterson I said, hey, what's up? Nice name drop, by the way.
I
How
will.
cool is that?
I didn't mean
I love
I
it.
just saw him. So anyway, yeah, I didn't mean to do that, but in any event, yeah. But we talked about it yesterday,
Yeah.
so it's all very fresh in my mind.
Hmm. Yeah, thinking about the role of men in all of this, it just struck me as interesting that um, as long as the men have the right opinion
Mhm.
on this, then they're free to speak. As long as they're going to be allies
Yes.
to the other
Yeah.
side,
Yep.
then they're totally welcome into the conversation. Or as long as it's 9 Supreme Court justices who handed down Roe v. Wade, or I guess not
Yes.
all 9, but
Yep.
all men who decided that, then it's totally fine. So it really is,
But
I
it's
think, a
that
double
double standard.
standard.
Yeah, it's that double standard for women too, is in terms of the
Mhm.
kind of women that we will listen to and believe and promote. It's all leftist women. Think about how many celebrity women do we know by one name that are pro-life?
Mhm.
I don't think we can think of one that everybody, if you
No.
threw out to any group of people, if you just said her first name, Lila's probably as close as we get. But the people on the left don't know who she is. I mean, it's not,
Mm-mm.
it just is it's so one-sided. And again, it's
Yeah.
because of this cultural piece, because that's where they have spent all of their energies.
Yeah. So, speaking of feminism, I'm really curious your opinion on pro life feminists. Do you think it's possible to be a pro life feminist, or is that a problematic term?
Um, if you had asked me this probably 5 years ago, I probably would have said yes. I think if you're going to be a pro-life feminist, you have to have a very specific definition of what you mean by feminism, which is not mainstream feminism. And partially because, just in the research that I found, there's a very clear pattern of feminism that, it starts in the 1800s, and it is this idea of the independent woman. It started with Percy Shelley, who's the author who's wrote about this woman named Sithna, and Sithna became this icon for the feminists in the 1800s. But part of their vision was really, there were three things going on. The first was the occult, which is we see throughout the movement. You don't even have to look very far at all in the movement today, in the pro-abortion movement, to see how involved the occult is. The second one is the second element of feminism is free love. This idea, that's the 1800s word, but we would just say no more monogamy, or whatever kind of sexual partners you want to have. That's another key piece of it, and it was the desire for women to have lives like men. In fact, all of these elements are. This is really the thrust of feminism, is to make women's lives more like men's. So you've got the occult, free love, and then the third piece is radical egalitarianism, which we've come to know as smashing the patriarchy. So saying you can't have any kind of a hierarchy, whether it's in the church or the military or even the government. Everybody has to be equal, and that's a very feminine way of envisaging things, of lessening the playing field. Um, So these three things together are what are driving, and this idea of women becoming like men, that's what's driving the abortion movement, I think, at this point. If you look at all the women in the 1960s and 70s, women like Kate Millett. I mean, Kate Millett wrote this book called Sexual Politics, and these ideas are just rife through her work. She was very much a student of the New Left. Wilhelm Reich wrote the book called The Sexual Revolution, where they were trying to get rid of any kind of family and taboos. And she was his disciple. And so she was the one that wanted to take these New Left ideas and put them into the world, apply them to women. So anyway, this is obviously a lot of minutia. But if you want to start really looking at what's driving abortion numbers, it's this feminist ideology that says, I have to work. This was a whole other push of it, was this part of the independence piece, was trying to get women out of the home and into working, because that's what good Marxists did. There was some communists back in the 1940s that had to deal with the question, is it work to raise children? And they decided, no, it's not productive work to raise children. So they wanted to push everybody outside the home, and this is why you've got Betty Friedan's book, who she was clearly a communist. There's been a lot of research done on this, why she was so focused on this idea of calling the home the comfortable concentration camp, so that she could get women out of the home. She used a lot of psychological tactics to encourage women to leave the home. The fear of missing out, and all of these kinds of and envy of men had better lives than we do. So anyway, I think when you start looking at all of these pieces, you begin to see that you're actually working against yourself if you're promoting feminism as a woman who is pro-life, because feminism, this idea that women have to work and the women have to be like men, that's been the driver of all of this from the 1960s onward, and you would never have gotten to Roe without that influence of the Marxist piece in the 60s and 70s. I think it's I think you could probably do a really great job of trying to redefine feminism, but I think that the way that it stands now, you're kind of working against yourself by trying to put the two together.
What doesn't make sense to me is if you were to ask the average mainstream feminist, we'll use that term, they would say, well, women are powerful, and we like to talk about, how powerful women are. But really, when you think about when it comes time for them to make the abortion argument, they're talking about how limited in capability women really are. Well, you can't do this and this. Women really aren't strong enough to handle all of this. It's just so contradictory to me.
Mm-hmm. No, and this is the mind control. I mean, this is the ideology that they want you to view power the way that they view it, through the lens that they view it, and they want you to feel trapped in that. So yeah, it's incredibly limiting. But I think you're right that bringing up those kinds of pieces is what gets people thinking, and I think it's really important to show those kinds of contradictions.
I mean, it's the pro-life women who are making the argument, you know what, we are strong enough to have a family and a career if that's what we choose. Or, we are strong enough to, and it just, that is so lost on so many feminists. It boggles my simple mind, Carrie.
Well, I don't think you're alone, but I think this is the power of the ideology because one of the key pieces that they want is they want women to be victims. They want women and men to be victimizers. And so they see this kind of empowerment happening on their terms, in this idea of radical independence that's separated from husbands and children. And so that's where you can see really the manipulation that is happening, such that you can be both a victim, but then you're empowered because of your victimhood. There's a lot of really crooked and twisted elements to all of it. But yeah, I think when you really get into the weeds and start seeing what is driving abortion, it's feminism. Mm-hmm. And I think for a long time people didn't want to talk about, pro-lifers didn't want to talk about feminism because it felt like such a live wire. Like, this is not going to be a winning argument. And, Scott, I'm sure you remember this. Back in the 80s and 90s, you had movies like 9 to 5. You had Working Girl with Melanie Griffith. Is that her
Yep,
name?
yep.
Melanie Griffith.
Melanie Griffith.
Big hair, and these women were just powerful and had these great ideas, and they showed the men. I mean, this is really the heyday of feminism. But I think we've gotten to the point now where, especially younger women, I'm really amazed at younger women who just don't want anything to do with feminism. They don't see any reason for it. They don't see the value in it. It's so I think that minds and trends are changing a lot because, the appeal of working 60 hours a week and for nothing else and doing nothing else is just not holding their attention like it did for my generation. So anyway, I'm really heartened by that. And I think we have a great opportunity as pro-lifers to start pointing this out. Just all, like what you just mentioned, Scott, these contradictions of what feminism appears to be promoting, and yet it can't, it can't follow through on those, it can't bring about those promises. It doesn't have the capacity to bring about what it's promising women.
Carrie, how did you get into all of this work? What was there a mind shift for you, or were you always passionate about this? Tell us a little bit about the personal side of this for you.
Yeah, I've always been pro-life. I think I joke about how I was pro-choice for about 3 hours after I came home from school for sixth grade, because my children, not my children, my friends had told me all about how great Geraldine Ferraro was, and she was pro-choice and all of that. And then I think my dad got home from work and straightened me out very, very quickly. But yeah, I just have had a huge heart for the abortion issue for a long time. But I know when I was in graduate school, I actually said I will never work on women's issues. But part of it was because I found it so dry and uncompelling. I mean, if you read, there's a fair amount of intellectual work out there on women that I think is really compelling. The work, certainly John Paul II, a lot of people that have made commentary on his works, which are great and important and, kind of seminal documents. But these are not the kinds of things that I could just find myself handing off to family and friends and say, why don't you read this commentary, philosophical argumentation for the ontological equality of women.
That's a favorite of mine, by the way. I really enjoy that.
You've heard it, you've read that one. Yeah, no. It's in the top 5, I think, greatest hits of philosophical minutia. But and that was really what I was rejecting, was this overly academic approach to womanhood. And I sort of fell into it. I wrote a book where I had a chapter where I was asking the question: are we in the age of Mary? Because there's so many apparitions of Mary and whatnot happening, and Mary's obviously the Blessed Virgin is considered the most powerful woman in history because of her influence on art and music and architecture, and over and over. Our Lady of Guadalupe, that. I think that's considered the largest mass conversion of pagans to Christianity in all of history. Something like 10 million people became Christian because of that. So anyway, I was looking at that aspect and then really realizing that our culture is so opposite of who we understand the Virgin Mother to be. And I realized we're living in this kind of almost anti-Marian culture. And so I ended up writing a book. I wrote a chapter about that. And actually the publisher then said, could you write a whole book on this? And I thought, I hope there's enough stuff. I signed the contract and thought, I hope there's enough. And anyway, it's just been abundant. There's so much content out there in terms of the occult elements and, all these pieces that really point to something very deeply wrong with women, especially since the 1960s. And then the second book came about because people said, can you write something that's more palatable to people who aren't Catholic, that are either secular or Protestant, that I can give to my friends and neighbors. And so that was the book that I just came out with last summer, back in August. And it's been really I think, a great experiment for me to sort of figure out how do we make arguments that are intellectually serious and important, but in a way that's very readable. So I pull a lot of punches in terms of wanting to include different philosophers and their theories in these books, but I don't think there's a lot of things that I sacrifice because of it, because I think they are page turners. I think my first book about women, the record was someone read it in 2.5 hours. So it's, it tells me that people are reading it and absorbing a lot from it and getting a lot from it. And so that's really obviously what's what's driving me. But it's just this idea of how do we start helping women and children, the family, the culture? How do we start pulling these things back? Because objectively, none of these things that are being promoted aren't working for anyone. So how do we start reframing them in such a way that people can think of them afresh and then share with neighbors? And it's also just amazing to hear too, just women's lives that are being changed by this. And particularly resentment. That's the one thing that I think women, we hold on to so deeply, is the resentment that we have at things that happened to us in the past, or problems in our relationships. And you can really move forward dramatically when you can drop those kinds of things and start seeing yourself afresh in a relationship with a husband or parents or children, without hanging on to that resentment, which of course is being fomented, all over by the leftist media. So yeah, it just keeps building on itself, I think. So that's been the exciting aspect of it.
You mentioned you've referenced faith. What we have seen, one of the things where we are able to monitor a lot of these political battles that go around, in the States now, especially related to abortion and that sort of thing. And one of the arguments the other side loves to make is, keep your religion off my body, right? Or some variance of that. I think that's probably pretty effective to those in the middle who may not have a strong opinion on abortion, although I think that's a small group of people. But they certainly like, oh yeah, I don't want your religion on, I don't want you to force your religion on me. What's a good response to that when people make that claim of keep your religion away from me?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say maybe pivot and just say this doesn't really have anything to do with religion. This has to do with human flourishing. This has to do with what kind of culture you want to live in. This has to do with what kind of family that you think is going to be the bedrock of civilization. We know the family is vital. So I think there's a way to diffuse that without getting into the theological weeds, because this is one of the things that gets hard again about the depth that we can go into. We could write entire books on that topic. But if you can pivot and say something different and just point out, like, this isn't a theological argument. This is look at what has happened to the decadence in our culture. Look at what has happened to divorce rates. Look at what's happened to women, depression rates, suicide rates. All of these elements are pointing to incredibly unhappy people. And this is not being aided. Abortion is contributing significantly to that. So anyway, I think that would be, if you're in a casual conversation with somebody, or even if you're outside on the sidewalk talking with somebody, who may not listen to you anyway, it's better to start planting some kind of a different seed instead of getting into the weeds. I think would be sort of a quick and dirty approach.
Yeah. Carrie, this has been so helpful, and I know and will be insightful for our listeners who I think we all just need help thinking about all of this. Sometimes it's easy to get tunnel vision and, we know what we believe, and I think you've helped us understand how we can speak to people who don't believe the same way we do and how we can cast a compelling vision for life. If people want to know more, if they want to read their books or just hear more from you, where can they find you?
Yeah, the best place to find my work is either at carriegress.com or my blog, which is called theologyofhome.com, which has our books. We have a daily newsletter that we publish. We kind of aggregate content. It's sort of a poor woman's magazine, actually, truth be told, because I didn't have the wherewithal to be able to hire people to write all these articles. So Noelle Mering and I aggregate just kind of our favorite stuff from all over the web that we know appeals to women's hearts and interests. And so that comes out every day too, if people would just want more of content that isn't, that you can actually read while your 9-year-old son is standing over your shoulder, and, or that you could pass on to a 14-year-old daughter. So those are the best places to find my work.
And again, it's Carrie Gress, CarrieGress.com. Thank you very much, Carrie, for joining us. This has been fantastic.
Oh, thank you guys. It's really been a pleasure.
Thanks again for joining us here on Dear Jane. I'm Scott Baker. She is Marcy Little.